Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Adrian Andreas, and I serve as the Conference and Partnerships Manager here at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I'm so honored to be your host for today's Serve 365 webinar, Christian Nationalism and the Multiracial Far Right. This is part one of a special two-part series we're hosting to explore how Christian nationalism is finding traction across racial and ethnic lines, including in Black and Brown Christian evangelical spaces, and how faith-rooted leaders from those very communities are reclaiming theology in service of justice, dignity, and liberation. This conversation is not just timely, it's essential. At Americans United, we believe that separation of church and state is a shield for religious freedom, democracy, and equality. And it is our responsibility to name the ways that Christian nationalism is being co-signed, in some cases repackaged within our own communities of color. Before we dive in, a few quick housekeeping notes. Our interpreter for today is Patty. To enable ASL interpretation, click the icon globe in your Zoom toolbar. If you don't see it, you may need to update your Zoom client, and note this feature is not available via browser. For closed captioning, click the CC button in your meetings control to enable live captions. You're more than welcome to post your questions in the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to uplift as many as we can during the discussion. And please note that this webinar is being recorded, and all registrants will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with the recording link and any resources or toolkit shared during the session. Today's conversation is a part of our Serve 365, a year-round virtual series presented by Americans United for Separation of Church and State. These conversations offer a taste of the dynamic cross-issue programming that takes place at our annual Summit for Religious Freedom, also known as SURF. SURF 365 creates an ongoing space for community, education, and action across movements, from church-state separation and religious freedom to racial justice, LGBTQ plus rights, and reproductive freedom and democracy itself. To learn more, visit us at www.thesurf.org. And with that, I'll pass it to our incredible moderator, Mari Hirose, Chief Program Officer at Americans United, to guide us through today's conversation. Thank you, Mari.
Thank you so much, Adriana. And before we dive into the conversation, I want to take a moment to introduce our panelists, each of whom brings deep experience and perspective to today's discussion on faith, identity, and the far right. First, we have Reverend Tracy Blackman, who is the CEO and founder of Hope Builds and the former Associate General Minister of Justice and Local Church Ministries for the United Church of Christ. She's a nationally recognized leader in movements for racial and social justice. She's based in Missouri. Next, Reverend Dr. Douglas Aviles Bernal serves as Executive Minister of the Evergreen Association of American Baptist Churches. Born in Guatemala, he is a bridge between many different cultures and between English and Spanish. He is currently based in Washington State. And finally, Bishop Tanya Rawls is a founding pastor of Sacred Souls Community Church and executive director of the Freedom Center for Social Justice. She centers Black queer faith and leads with a commitment to spiritual liberation and justice. She is based in North Carolina. We're so grateful to have all three of you here to speak about your experiences with Black and Brown faith communities across the country. And in addition, Reverend Blackman and Reverend Doug are members of AU's Board of Trustees, and we at AU are thankful for your steadfast support of our mission to safeguard church-state separation. I hope that today's conversation will surface internal tensions, lived experiences, and points of resistance within Black and Brown Christian communities. So we will just kick it right off. And to open, and while we wait for Reverend Blackman, who's running a little late, I would love to ask Bishop Rawls and Reverend Doug to share one word or a phrase that captures how your community is grappling with or resisting Christian nationalism.
For me, and first, it's an honor to be here and part of this amazing conversation. It's clearly so timely and necessary. The word, and it's interesting because when we think about all the stuff that's going on, and then to say, now condense that down to a word. And what I found fascinating was the word that came for me was celebration. The word celebration came because what we have learned, and again, geographic location is relevant in this case, in the sense that I'm working in the Bible Belt. I'm based in the Bible Belt, rather, I should say. My work is national, but what we have learned down here is we celebrate every win. A win could be somebody making a shift from I don't think gays should even be allowed to do anything to, you know what, I really can't do harm while I'm trying to figure it out. That gets a huge win, even if someone were to say, well, you really didn't get a win because they didn't change the policy. Yeah, but they changed, but the heart is changing. And so I think it's important for us to walk in ways that enables us to see the moments of celebration, especially in this season, we're in this time and space, right? Historically, it takes time for certain things to change. And if we're not careful, we'll miss the beauty and the celebration along the way.
I love that. Thank you. And it's so important in these times. Reverend Doug?
I think no community is monolithic, but I would say we have two words. On the one hand is disappointment on the part of the Latino community who felt themselves exempt from what the leadership was discussing, the administration was discussing. And the other one is disappointment that the other side that did not feel themselves exempt, the ones who escaped abuse and etc., found themselves in the beginnings of a very familiar strong man who is really a weak man takeover of their country. So it's a betrayal and disappointment.
Thank you. And welcome, Reverend Blackman. We were just starting out asking all of the panelists to share one word or phrase that captures how your community is grappling with or resisting Christian nationalism.
One word or phrase. Well, I'm glad to be here. And I would say we are in a bit of a conundrum in this moment. My community is wrestling with diverse expressions of theology around this moment, dealing with the complexity of what it means to be the target of so much of what is happening right now, and also complicit in what's happening right now. And so, unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot of internal dis-ease, a lot of contentious discourse around a lot of things that I'm sure some of which we will speak to today. And also, glimpses of hope as we find ourselves needing one another in ways that we always have, but have sometimes strayed away from. So it's just really a mixture of depends on what group I'm with at what time as to how that shows up.
So I heard in both your remarks and Reverend Doug's the theme of complicity, and I'd love to have the panelists speak a little bit about how you see Christian nationalist ideology resonating or being echoed in your community's discourse or priorities. And maybe we'll start with Reverend Doug.
For a lot of the Latino community, the faith that we have received is the racist late 19th century up to 1950s faith in the United States from the missionaries there, and then we have stayed there. So in a sense, Christian nationalism fits really well with that which we have been taught, which includes, the gender issues. It includes the female hierarchy, wherein the females are meant to serve the males, and the male is the supreme voice, and you should listen. All of that fits very well within the culture, the Christian culture we have been taught. And so therefore, there's this affinity that the Christian right is just discovering now, and they're using it and abusing it. The problem, of course, is that that we are failing to realize that though they are using us, we are not included. The Latino community is never going to be part of of whatever they're trying to build, which is a white supremacy state. And that is the problem. Now, the difficulty in that is that they have been brilliant at marrying our faith with the governments we have escaped. Many of us have escaped. So, for example, the Cubans and Venezuelans, there was a huge campaign letting them know that Democrats are socialist in the sense of the Castro and the Maduro in Venezuela. So they were convinced that a vote for Democrats was a vote to have them go back to that which they escaped. And for the rest of the Latinos, we were told that, for example, the Mexican Americans and the Caribbeans in the Northeast and the Mexican Americans in California and the Southwest, we were told that this was a crime issue, that it was a security matter, and as long as you had your documentation correct, you would be fine. All they were going to do was get rid of crime in your neighborhood. And it was amazing because they said, God is guiding us in this.
Mhm.
And the Latino community really, once you hear God is guiding us, and it grabs our hearts, and it grabs our emotional strengths, and too many of us fell for that, and which is why we saw the increase. No one likes Trump more. I know that the propaganda is that the Latinos are realizing how great Trump is, but it had nothing to do with Trump. It had everything to do with appealing to our root faith as the colonial faith we received, appealing to that root. And on top of that, then they added our fears that made us come here. And they married those things, and that increased the vote, which is why now the Venezuelans and Cubans are profoundly disappointed because they thought they were exempt from the treatment they are now receiving. And the rest of the Latino community is also disappointed because they're not bothering with real criminals because that's too much work. And is not really their intent anyway. So on the whole, it was a very effective campaign of propaganda to speak to our fears as a community and ground that on the colonial faith we had received, and those two things together got them what they needed to be. Whether that's going to change or not, I think it can, but that's where we are now, in a broad sense.
Reverend Blackman or Bishop Rawls, what similarities or differences do you see in your communities?
I see it's interesting. First of all, thank you, Reverend Doug, for that amazing analysis. It's one of the more profound ones I've actually heard. Thank you for laying that out in terms of particularly the dual pieces, because similar to the Latino community, many think of Black folk as a monolithic kind of community, and we are so not that, right? And so if you're thinking about how to appeal to us, how to approach us, and if you're doing that from a monolithic mindset, you're going to miss automatically. But what comes to mind for me, I also went back to kind of an origin story moment, and it happened for me when I was in Ghana at one of the slave castles. And it was my first time being in this experience where I go into an area where my ancestors would have been taken prior to being put on a ship to come to America. When I walked into this space, this castle, which is, even when you think about the language, a castle, a slave castle, right? The first thing I saw was the cross. The first thing I saw was the church. And it was amazing to me because as I went into the women's slave dungeon was on this side, the male slave dungeon was on that side, and the church was right in the middle. And so by the time we went through being separated from our families, children stolen from us, raped. In fact, actually in the women's slave dungeon, there was a set of stairs. And I asked, well, what is that? Where did those stairs go? And they said, oh, the captain's room is there so that he could get his pick of the litter of the young virgins and the like that were there. So by the time we get put on the ship, we had already been indoctrinated. And the thing that centered it was what? The cross. And the ways that we were rewarded for being a good slave versus being a bad slave. And the good slaves were the ones who followed Christian protocols, right? And so I had to go there because when we think about Christian nationalism, what was vital was to be able to have obedient Black folk come to the States. And so that obedience also, when thinking about how in our traditions, whether we're thinking about the United Methodist Church or the AME Church, right? There were these breaks that happened along racial lines in some instances, but not the core genesis. Like it's like you'd have to take out your DNA. Our DNA as African Americans in particular is so grounded in this trauma. And so when, there were those who were saying, well, the increasing number of young Black men who voted for the right, or those who have opted out, those kind of things. It's going to be really vital for us as we're moving forward to understand that when we're talking about white Christian nationalism, we're talking about something that has been ingrained in many instances in Black folk, in Black church culture in particular. But there are also those who are understanding as we look at more of the translations of original text that so much of what we have learned, like if you look at the slave Bible, for example, there was a specific slave Bible. You look at the slave Bible, it's excluded anything that supports the things that my brother referenced: women having a voice, children being able to stand and protest, all of these very things. So I think we have to understand the complexities of what it means to talk about the shifts. I will say lastly, I'm actually somewhat encouraged. And well, first of all, I'm eternal optimist, but barring that, I'm also a realist, right? As a student of history. And so one of the things that's important for us to keep in context: 1965 was not that long ago, y'all, historically, right? I mean, I just got the right to vote in 1965, like, protected in that way. Slavery didn't end that long ago. There are people who remember the separate water fountains that are still alive. And so when we understand that, I think it's important for us to keep in mind a timeline, and that I will not see the benefits of the work I'm doing now. It will manifest in generations from now, but we have to do the work now.
I think I want to pick up where Bishop Rawls is ending. I certainly share that analysis of the embedding of a certain type of Christianity that I don't believe was intended from the beginning, but a certain type of Christianity, and certainly with what Reverend Doug was saying as well. But I think something also happened during the freedom movements and the civil rights movements. And I think that there was, first, let me say, unlike our Latinx siblings, there is no path to white assimilation for anyone in the Black community. So that's never been like a major thing, right? The one of the powers of white Christianity and whiteness, period, is the ability to make more white people. And we've seen that. When I say that, people say, what are you talking about? Well, Italians haven't always been able to identify as white. Jews haven't always been able to identify as white. Latinx have not always been able to identify as white. But as whiteness, as a social construct, sees itself shrinking, then it makes room for a more expansive interpretation. Irish people have not always been seen as white. That's never been the point for Black people. What is relevant in that moment, though, is that integration perhaps was perceived by too many as a pathway to equality, and to freedom in a way that it never was for us. And so this interpretation of biblical texts, of theology around prosperity, around working hard, and that's a way that you get ahead. That has never been a level playing field for us. And I think as we've adopted more of this this idea that proximity to whiteness means proximity to liberation and free and being free. It has been a problem in our neighborhoods because it undermines our communal way of being. And now we're in a place where we're having to examine that more closely. I hope you understand what I mean by that. In that, you can be Black and wealthy, but the wealthy does not eliminate the oppression that comes from being Black. You can be Black and educated in some of the best schools, and that education may get you further along in a certain way, but it does not eliminate what this nation does to people who are Black. And so the skewing of the gospel towards the more you accumulate, the more you have, the more you achieve, um, you know, causing some people to then associate with um, white Christian theology more closely has not served us well. I'm still thinking that through from what I heard here, but I know that that's a big piece of why you have some Black churches that ascribe to white Christian nationalism, even though it's a Black denomination, or a Black congregation. The prosperity, the get it by your bootstraps, the God is in favor of what we're doing to women. God is in favor of alienating us from our queer siblings. God is in favor of people, even the literature that says the poor will be with us always. Biblically, that text does not mean we have to all have poor people. It is Jesus making a critique of the fact that we have poor people because we have greedy people, but we don't read it that way, right? And so I think that that too has to be brought into the conversation of the complicity that I'm talking about. Once we start to turn on one another, we have a harder road ahead.
I love how you're speaking about sort of the forms of Christian theology that Christian nationalists are pushing. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the King James Version of the Bible, which is what we're seeing often in policies that Christian nationalist politicians are pushing. It's that version of the Bible that they want in the classrooms. There's a certain version of Ten Commandments or certain version of the Bible instruction that they are favoring. And I would love to hear from the panelists about that.
I think that's a great question, first of all, and I totally agree with actually Reverend Blackman's critique as well. My background before the United Church of Christ was Baptist and Church of God in Christ. So trust, I am well aware of the ways that not only the way white Christian nationalism creeps in, but I thought about what it did to me as an individual, right? Like we're not out here and then that's in here. I remember when I preached my trial sermon and an old woman from the front row saw an anointing and said, "You better preach, preacher." And I had never heard anybody say preacher and woman connected. And I literally, in the middle of my sermon, and you all who are preachers understand, right? Froze because it was so ingrained in me that as a woman, I wasn't in the Church of God in Christ at the time, I was in another tradition. But when this woman yelled that out, my soul couldn't accept it.
Mhm.
Y'all hear what I'm saying? And that's relevant when thinking about the varied ways that the King James Version of the Bible, which was the one I grew up with, the one I went through my formation with, frames so much of not only my thinking, but my soul itself, right?
Mhm.
And so when I think about, Genesis and this whole origin story, the thing about God created Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve to support this idea that somehow God could not create somebody like me who is a same gender loving woman. But
Mhm.
if you run down to Genesis 5, Genesis 5 says, and in the beginning created he him, male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called them Adam in the name when they were created. That's the King James Version that says that. Why do you never hear that preached? I can't hear that preached if I'm in a traditionalist environment, because that translation, that interpretation, that text would suggest to me that actually God did create us all as equals. God did not relegate women to some low class status. As a matter of fact, we know that's true when we think about who Jesus talked to first when he when he after the cross, after the cross, Jesus talked to more girls than he did guys, right? I mean, he gave the biggest assignments to who? To women. Okay, so if we're really thinking about this in a way of looking at the way God looks at us, I think it's important to understand, particularly when you think generationally, because I think this is also a bit of a generational conversation. I just turned 67. And so when thinking of me as a baby boomer, that conversation is going to look very different for me, who had the background I just told you about. The reason I got free was because I have had to do a lot of intentional work around decolonizing my mind, and that's just real. You can't assume you can take the mind and the spirit and the translations, because again, when we're reading text, holy text, we're reading it through the lens of our experiences, right? And so if I have difficulty even seeing myself as a woman, as someone queer, as someone Black, if I have a difficulty getting through that frame, then I'm likely going to be more prone to lock into the Christian nationalist view, because that's what I know. That's what I am most familiar with. The other piece that's important to note here is the opposite of that will make me uncomfortable. It will. The opposite of that may cause me to lose a lot. That's a fact, right? The opposite of that may alienate me from people that I care about. So there are a lot of prices to be paid for a willingness to break from Christian nationalist positions. And we're seeing that played out now with this administration in particular, but it's not unique to this administration. I want to say we act like this is like the worst. Well, we've had bad times, okay, and we'll get through this. We will. And that's one thing I want to say lastly. If y'all want to know how to get through something, look at Black people in America, okay? What we know how to do is get through without any assumption from support on the outside, to Reverend Blackman's original statement, and also some to Reverend Doug when acknowledging what the experience is like if I'm coming from Mexico versus me coming from Spain. I'm going to have two totally different experiences in this country, right? So I'll stop there.
May I add just a little piece to that I didn't talk about, but Bishop, you made me think about it. It's also enticing because of this element of obedience. Because of the subjugation of Black people in the United States, obedience was also a technique of survival. So we taught our children to be obedient, to follow the rules, to not question authority in the same way, because it was necessary to survive. And when that translates to a person or persons that have authority in your religious life, standing in a pulpit week after week, culturally, there is a conditioning to accept what comes across the pulpit, to accept what is being said to you. Now, obviously, that wasn't unilateral, in spite of the slave Bible, which was what was used to teach the enslaved. In spite of that, somehow these people who didn't even come from this place originally found a Jesus and a God who frees in the midst of all of that, right? So I'm not saying it's hopeless, but this element of obedience. And even now, even in this society, if you ask a Black family about the talk, most of us know what that is, that we have to I have two adult Black boys, and I can still remember having to sit down with them. They're Black men, but they're my boys. Sit down with them, with their father, and talk to them about how to behave if they're ever stopped by law enforcement. Both of them have been stopped by law enforcement. Neither of them were guilty of anything. And they've been stopped multiple times. And so this active, while you're teaching young people to be resilient and to be independent, one must also teach them to survive. And I think that sometimes that also connects. I like to hear what Reverend Doug and Bishop Tanya have to say about that, but it also connects religiously because it translates into that relationship of a pastor being an authority. It's how you get Ted Cruz saying something on TV that's absolutely ridiculous and believing it because it comes from authority.
Yeah, I think in the Latino world, the Spanish-speaking world, the version of the King James is called Reina y Valera, is the last names of the two authors. And they were both published around the same time. Reina Valera comes from 1602, King James was 1611. And they're in the same sphere, and they focus on obedience. That's the role of it is obedience and hierarchy. Those are the two core principles that we are taught. That the lower you are in the hierarchy spectrum, the more obedience is demanded of you. And the higher you go in the hierarchy, the less obedience and consequences that you get. And we have been taught that over generations and generations, so much so that it's imbued in our culture now. A way out for the Latino world, a possible door that it's opening is that the Latino and Latina people in the United States, we live with translation daily, constantly. There's always translation. So for some of us who are on the reasonable side of faith, one of our biggest arguments currently is to say to them two things. This is you're under a colonial oppression that is supposedly grounded on scripture, and also the translation is wrong. The oppressive parts of the translation that you're receiving is wrong. And those two arguments could be helpful and powerful if done correctly, because what we're saying then is two things that are freeing, that are profoundly understood. For the Latino community, colonialism is lived and relived reality that we know we need to escape. And because we know the consequences of a mistranslation, there's a deeper connection there we can make with our community to say the problem is not scripture, is that you've been taught the wrong translation of scripture. And let's explore a more correct translation of scripture. And those two together could offer a space. But I love what Reverend Tracy and Bishop Rawls said about the fact that we have to decolonize ourselves. And part of that is the talk, but in the sense that we have been told that there's a reality that we live under, and that reality is powerful. But at the same time, as Bishop Rawls said, since the 1960s, we have the means now to begin to effect change, provided we come together. If we show up for voting, this, as I can't remember who said it, the reason they're afraid of us, which is why they want to keep us from voting. If our vote didn't matter, they wouldn't care. But because it matters, they fight so hard to keep us from voting. If we just show up, change can happen. So we have to have the struggle. But some of it is the obedience that Reverend Tracy was talking about. And I'll end with this. We have been taught that obedience is biblical and questioning is not. It's the opposite. What we need to do is that follow Jesus' example that says that questioning comes first, and then informed obedience. We should change that. What I say is questioning comes first, and then it allows you to join and participate, which is not the same as unquestioning obedience.
Yeah. Those are great points. And one of the things that came to mind as you were talking, Reverend Doug, was the beloved Gustav Gutierrez. If we really understand the fact that our two communities are intrinsically linked together. But nobody wants to really talk about that, because if you really talk about it, right, when we think about liberation theologies, that birthing in Latin America, and the ways that of all the groups to fight, they fought and won against the Catholic Church. Are you kidding me? Right? Like, we have models of this success. And then to think about what that seed did when coming into the States. And so now we have womanist theology. Now we have Black theology. And now we even what have gay theology. Okay. My organization, the Freedom Center for Social Justice, hosts a gathering called Liberating Theologies every year. And we have not only older scholars, but we also have emerging scholars. And one of them came to our last session, y'all. First year not even D-Min, first year MDiv student. They came and said, I am presenting a new theology today called theology. Theology. And that, Reverend Blackman, that look you just had, we all of us were like, what's getting ready to happen? That child broke down this notion of why are we so hung up on binaries when we serve a triune God? I said, you just better shut up, okay? Because they're not, gender nonconforming, and said that actually, when we're thinking about the divine in binary ways, we miss out on the bigness of the God we serve. I'm giving that example to say that inherently spirit is a dynamic presence. And that dynamicism, if we're willing and courageous enough to lean into it, will inevitably lead to greater forms of liberation. And I'm excited about that prospect. And again, to this point of which versions of the Bible, and I'm so amazed when I think about the fact that people who want to go and hold on to the King James Version, I always say to them, what's the last word in that again? Version, okay, which suggests that there are clearly other versions. So somebody had a lens that they looked through that lens, they created this flow. And I'm not trying to take nobody's faith. God is real. I love Jesus. Okay. But I am saying that you cannot extract the fact that there were political leanings in terms of how that book in particular, that version in particular, was created and why, right? So we have to be willing to ask some of those questions. Some of those are newer questions for others, which is why I want to close with this piece, and that is we have to, when I talk about decolonizing my mind, to your point, Reverend Doug, um, it's impossible for me to do liberative work and be bound, like be greatly bound. I'm going to be bound until I die. I mean, I'm just too old, right? I don't have enough time. And I'm not saying that casually. I'm saying that there is so far I can come, but there are others who will come behind that will have greater truth, greater revelation. And I'm grateful for that.
Bishop Rawls, you're talking about some of the examples of forms of resistance or persuasion that you're seeing in your communities against Christian nationalism.
Yes.
And are there other examples from any of the speakers that you could highlight about resistance or persuasion that you've seen or that you engage in to push back on Christian nationalist alignment?
Well, I'm a follower of many liberation theologians, and so many of them have been named here, and there are others in all of those categories. Um, I would say about a decade ago, I was still pastoring a local congregation, and I started shifting my language. And so I began saying from the pulpit that I was assigned to, and also I do a lot of guest preaching. I would often start by acknowledging the Bible, as a people's book about a holy God and not God's book about a holy people. Now, that doesn't sound like it would jar many people, but it did. It jarred a lot of people. And I would often get asked questions about why I am speaking that way. And it was my own little battle of beginning to expand people's understanding of what the canonized text is. We don't do a lot of teaching about that. But everything, even the Bible itself, says that everything that happened and everything that Jesus did is not included here. Even the Bible itself says that, right? And these 66 books that were canonized were chosen in a room full of men who had agendas as well. Does that make it not sacred? No. And that wasn't my point. The point was to expand the notion that any text is the only text, to make room for other people's narratives to also be considered holy and divine. And I think that that's work that the church resists in some ways, but it is authentic work to what was intended. Even in the canonized texts that we have, even Jesus's ministry is clear. Jesus self says, there are other sheep in other fold that you know not of, right? And so this idea that we need to hold the license on what it means to have the sacred and therefore hold the limits on who and how God is problematic, not just for Christianity, but for religious authoritarianism across this globe. And so I feel that that is a part of the work that we are called to do if we are privileged enough to have an audience, whether it's big or small, if we are privileged enough to influence people's lives by using literature that they consider sacred, then we have an obligation to interrogate that text and to lay it open in ways that makes room for others instead of excludes others. I think that that is squarely on the shoulders of those of us who profess to be called to share the gospel or to share some other expression. And Christianity is one of the most exclusive versions of religion. And so, therefore, we have a lot of work to do. So my engagement with liberation theologians that began to open my eyes, even some you wouldn't think. I was just writing the other day about Howard Thurman often would tell the story of his grandmother who would not let him read from certain portions of the Bible because those portions of scripture had been used to oppress people. And so she just didn't want to hear it, right? She just didn't want to hear it. And so taking out the mysticism and taking out the idolatry, which we are never commanded to do. The text is not to be worshiped. The text is to be used for teaching and training. If we begin to remove some of that, then we can have an expansive conversation about a God that we all acknowledge is too big for one comprehension. I want to say that and attached to the work of Americans United, it begins to build the absolute necessity for there to be a separation between church and state. Because just as you have the three of us, we largely agree, and we probably have places of disagreement. Religion is personal as much as it is public, and no one aspect, no one belief should be legislated for government's sake. I believe that with all of my heart, and that's why I support Americans United for separation of church and state. That the moment we are silent about anyone's religious interpretation governing the lives of everyone is the moment that religion becomes obsolete for everyone and the government becomes useless.
I think the timing of your statement, Reverend Tracy, is so profound. When I think about, I love that statement about that you said your opening piece in reference to not a God about a holy people, but right, like it's about the people. And so when we look at what's happening now with Israel and the US, there are those who fundamentally believe that biblically we have a responsibility to make sure that the holy land of Israel stays safe. And that's because of the translation or the interpretation, as you shared that earlier, that some are walking with, that of course we all have to make sure Israel is safe, regardless of what she does, regardless of how brutal she is. But if you think about America's history, is that not also our same culture? Like we don't want to own that or use that language, but it very much is true if something is opposite. And we also have both been guilty of being those who take other people's stuff. All right. And so when we think about it from that vantage point, a lot of what's happening on the global scale is also being impacted by this sense of not only Christian nationalism, but Christian exceptionalism. And that's a very dangerous thing. I am Christian, definitely. That is where I get my strength. However, that said, I am not exclusively so. I definitely celebrate my Jewish siblings, and I celebrate the fact that for me, the Old Testament comes alive through their traditions. I celebrate the fact that I think about the Buddhist community and the ways that, in terms of thinking about, meditation and the ways that they look very broadly. I'm a recent widow. My wife of 25 years passed a year and a half ago or so. And so what one of the things that the first thing that happened for me when I went to my first speaking engagement, we were protesting some of the horrible things that were happening to immigrants in North Carolina. And a group of Muslims came up to me and said to me, Bishop Rawls, we are so sorry about the passing of your wife. What we want you to know is that we as a community are here for you because we are here for the widows. Come on now. We are here for the widows. We are here. They did not care that I had a collar on. They did not care about my cross. What they saw was a widow, right?
Mhm.
That's when I think we are living our faith the best. When I can see beyond all the other factors. And they made it clear, the women and the men, we need you to know that we are here. They had never met me before. Did not know. I knew the head person, but I did not know anybody else who came up to me. That is the kind of faith I'm looking forward to us all walking in, where we're not afraid of the others understanding it is one God with a bunch of different bits.
Bishop
Okay.
Rawls, there are actually quite a few questions, and I think we can move on to the Q&A portion now, but quite a few questions around interfaith work, which you were just talking about. And many of the questions are really around what is meaningful solidarity from outside your community, whether it's interfaith or also interfaith and non-faith, uh, various racial communities. What are the best things that all of us could be doing, and what are common pitfalls or misunderstandings you've seen from allies or observers?
I would say that one of our biggest difficulties in interfaith and interreligious or in relationship with those who don't ascribe to any particular faith is mutual condescension. Sometimes we begin our conversations with our prejudices of we need to help these people grow out of whatever their wrongness is. And I see that happening quite often. We often refer to that as those people. How do we teach, for example, in our Christian spaces, how do we teach people without faith how good our faith is and how better it would be for them? And the other side is how do we teach Christians how trapped they are in this myth, et cetera, et cetera. And those prejudices seep through in our conversations. And then sometimes it's difficult for us to get past that. wherein having a broader conversation might help us in the sense that approaching it as co-equal partners addressing a difficult issue. I love what Bishop Rawls said about the Muslim conversation, that they were able to do exactly what I was trying to illustrate in a much better way. Within Islam, there are difficult questions regarding same-sex together. And so there are some spaces in it for allowing that. But they decided to say what's most important in this moment is her widowship. And I think that is a great space to begin. What is most important at this moment? The suffering. Let's work on that. And our differences, well, we'll have time later for that.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I've been trying in the circles that I'm working with now. Quite frankly, I'm not sure that that we're going to reach there through clergy. We have better luck with laity, actually, in this regard. But I'm reaching for language that transcends religiosity. Like all expressions of faith, and even people who profess no faith, we have moral guides in our lives, and there are um, examples of that no matter what the expression. We all want to be able to live safe and whole lives free from persecution. We all believe that the hungry should be fed. We all believe that people should have a right to be housed in shelter that protects them. Most of us believe, even those who say they don't, believe in some form of immigration. We are a nation of immigrants. And even as Christians, we often forget that Jesus was an immigrant too. And so there are these languages, these threads that we could reach for if we could take the accoutrements of religion off of them and make a statement that simply is about what it means to be human with one another, and connect in those places. We don't have the luxury right now of trying to convince one another what is right and wrong about our individual faiths. We need to understand that our ability to be human together is being threatened, and we need to work together towards that. And these are the places where we agree. Let's strengthen the places where we agree, and let's work toward the common good from those places where we agree. That's just how I'm beginning to approach this with people, right? And in terms of interfaith work, that may be that we have some expressions of religion that just can't get with other things. I'll use myself, for example. I do work with people who don't think women can preach or women who can be in the pulpit. I'm not trying to be in your pulpit. I'm trying to help be a voice in this moment against, I don't need a pulpit. I have enough of them. What I'm saying is, I'll use a concrete example and then I'll be quiet about it. I have a good relationship with the Archdiocese of the Catholic Church in St. Louis, Missouri. I have a good relationship with the Archbishop. I've been to the Archbishop's home. Some people haven't been there, the Catholic. I've met the Pope. And I was the lead person, the lead plaintiff in the case against abortion laws. Guess what? When we're together, we're not working on abortion. I'm not going to change how they feel about that. They're not going to change how I feel about that. But we do stand hand in hand in front of prisons and protest capital punishment. We do work on feeding the hungry together. We do work on the unhoused together. We have to become religious bodies that are not so exclusionary that we absolutely can't touch that which we don't completely understand. Can we build a larger frame that's beyond religiosity? That's my question, and that's my goal.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And we do have a lot of atheists in the audience and in our membership. And from Fred in Oklahoma, identifying as an atheist. I just wanted to lift up that he is thanking all the panelists for your example in wearing your religious experience in a purely non-harming manner for atheists. So thank you so much for that.
I'd like to say to what both of my colleagues have been lifting up. Um, I have to go back to generational stuff. Okay, so generationally, there are some views I think that those who are 45 and older hold that and grapple with that are, I'm finding, a little different than what a lot of younger people of faith are grappling with and thinking of. And I think that becomes important because one thing we haven't referenced is intergenerational faith work, right? It becomes really critical because they are the generation that's going to carry this vision forward, whatever it is that we're talking about. And one of the things I'm finding is more difficulty keeping intergenerational connections in place. And that said, then our translations, our interpretations of what's happening, why it's happening, and what should be appropriate responses. Because the truth is, this is the least religious generation of people we've ever had. I mean, older people, people are rejecting all faith traditions. That said, we still are at the very least tangentially connected as well. And so when thinking about, well, how do we do interfaith and interreligious work, I think we also have to factor in intergenerational because we're losing so many. I know for sure this is the least religious group of Black folk ever, generationally, right? Ever. And part of it is because they see us, they see the church, they see our underbelly. And technology is causing that. In real time, they're seeing stuff. And also in real time, they have other translations. So I think there's going to be these ways that love, and I know this might sound overly simplified, what my Muslim siblings did for me was showed me love. What you all are hearing in this conversation to my atheist siblings is what happens when love is the center. There is no room for harm. There is no need for tearing down in order for another to lift up. It is only love. And when we get to that place, and the thing I want to say lastly in reference to this is look at the texts that are pulled out to cause harm. Almost exclusively, they're in the Old Testament. Because if you step into the New Testament, you got to deal with Jesus. And if you deal with Jesus, he's going to be against every single thing almost that white nationalists are trying to stand on. And so I celebrate the younger folk in our midst. I celebrate those who do not embrace formal religion. But what I've also found is that many of those who profess no religion, and this is just my experience, no tradition, a lot of that doesn't have to do with the fact that they're not people of faith. It has more to do with, I can't deal with you, which is very different. And I want to note that because is there a belief in something? And I think there is a hope for something better than what we've been doing as the Christian church in particular.
Okay.
I'll just quickly begin with acknowledging that Christianity has been terrible to anyone who is not a Christian, as Bishop Rawls says, wrongfully, because Jesus did the opposite of that. And in that sense, a lot of the work on the Christian side is against these prejudices and sense of superiority that comes from this idea that being a Christian means being better, when in reality, it means to acknowledge how imperfect we are and how much work we need to do in our lives, which is something that the atheist community identifies with, to realize that none of us are perfect, nobody has it all together, and we all need each other to help. So I think that's a wonderful space to begin, to acknowledge the basis of our faith, in that we recognize that we're not perfect, and we do most of the things we do are against our own interests. And we need community to help us see better.
Well, we're just about at time for this webinar, but thank you so much for being with us, for sharing your wisdom, and for giving us hope. This was really a wonderful webinar. Thanks to your participation.